a woman's body was found decomposing in the California desert. There was no DNA, blood, hair, or other physical evidence that could directly tie the prime suspect to her murder. Police believed they had found the man responsible, but they still couldn't prove he killed her. Then came the strangest breakthrough of all. The evidence that finally helped establish the victim's time of death wasn't a fingerprint, a witness, or a confession. It was the maggots feeding on her body. Beginning in 1985, women around San Diego were repeatedly picked up by a stranger, driven into isolated mountain areas, choked unconscious, sexually assaulted, and abandoned in the desert. Some survived, others didn't. 3 years later, police finally stopped a silver Honda and arrested 41-year-old mechanic Ronald Porter. But catching a suspect was only the beginning. How could investigators prove that Porter was the predator they had been hunting for years? The answer was hiding on a body in the desert. This is the Evidence Room. Subscribe so you'll be notified whenever a new case drops. Now, let's get into the story. Between 1985 and 1988, 18 transients, hitchhikers, and prostitutes were attacked in the desert mountains of California. The women were choked until they lost consciousness, sexually assaulted, and then abandoned in remote areas and left for dead. The only witnesses were the insects of the desert, and eventually, those insects would become some of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. Not all of the victims died. Several survived, and when investigators compared their accounts, they discovered that the attacks followed an almost identical pattern. Many of the women were found with their pants undone or pulled down. Their bras had been pushed up, exposing their breasts. One victim even had a nipple ring removed. Investigators strongly suspected that some form of sexual assault had taken place, but because the women had been unconscious during much of the attack, proving exactly what had happened was extremely difficult. One of the survivors was Betty Bass. Years later, Betty still vividly remembered the night she accepted a ride from a stranger. At the time, she had a history of mental health problems and was homeless. After leaving a motel on El Cajon Boulevard, she began looking for a ride in the direction of Ramona, California. A man driving a silver car pulled over and offered to take her part of the way.
I can take you as far as El Centro.
Good enough.
He had a clean car, so I thought, that's a pretty good guy, pretty nice guy, I just thought he was okay.
As they drove through the mountains, the man suddenly said he needed to pull off the highway to take a bathroom break. He stopped the car on an isolated road. Then he walked around the vehicle and asked Betty to reach into the back seat and get something for him. As she leaned forward, he suddenly grabbed her from behind, wrapped his arm around her neck, and began choking her. The last thing Betty remembered was losing consciousness. When she finally woke up, the attacker was gone. She was alone in the desert. Weak and disoriented, Betty began searching for help.
So I walked and I walked and I walked. Well, I finally crawled over this fence. I crawled to the other side of the street. Some family came by and put me in their motorhome and aided me up a little bit, and then they took me to the hospital.
Investigators later returned to the attack site. The scene was in the dirt beside a small rise in the terrain. A vehicle's tire tracks stopped several feet away, and footprints led from the vehicle into the area where Betty had been attacked. Some of her clothing was also recovered nearby. Police carefully photographed the shoe prints and tire tracks. They also recovered 2 Marlboro cigarette butts. Then detectives noticed something extremely small on Betty's shirt. A tiny red carpet fiber. At the time, no one knew how important that fiber might eventually become. But Betty's attack was not an isolated incident. Only about a month earlier, another remarkably similar attack had occurred in the same general area too. Young women had been hitchhiking together near a restaurant close to the interstate. A silver compact car pulled over. The driver was a middle-aged man.
Where are you girls gone?
We're heading to Tucson.
Take you as far as El Centro.
Great.
Hop in.
The women accepted the offer. It became a ride they would never forget. Later, one of the victims contacted the sheriff's department.
No,
have any idea who he is?
The guy who picked us up hitchhiking.
That woman was fortunate. She survived. And the friend she feared had been killed was later discovered in the desert as well, terrified, but still alive. When detectives interviewed the surviving victims, their descriptions of the attacker were remarkably consistent. They described a man in his early 40s, with short, blondish, gray hair and glasses. Just as importantly, many of the women said that when they first met him, they felt comfortable getting into his car. He didn't initially appear threatening. The similarities went far beyond his appearance. The things he said to the women were so repetitive that investigators felt as though he were following a script. The encounters usually began with almost the same line.
I'm only going to El Centro.
The type of people he was victimizing were the vulnerable people in society.
His choice of victims was also consistent. He targeted some of the most vulnerable people in society, women struggling with mental health problems, drug addiction, homelessness, prostitution, or simply trying to hitchhike from one place to another. By this point, police had a general description of their suspect. They had tire tracks. They had shoe print evidence. They had a handful of physical clues, but they still didn't have a name. And somewhere in the mountains of California, a sexual predator was still hunting. San Diego's El Cajon Boulevard had long been a gathering place for prostitutes, runaways, transients, and hitchhikers. The reason was simple: location. The boulevard was close to an interstate entrance ramp, making it convenient for people looking for rides out of the city. And investigators soon realized that many of the victims had been picked up in this area. By this point, detectives were dealing with two groups of victims, those who had survived and those who had been found dead in the desert. Police believed the cases were connected. The pattern was remarkably consistent. The victims were similar. The locations where they were picked up were similar. The remote mountain areas where they were abandoned were similar. Investigators repeatedly found the same types of footprints and tire tracks. Everything suggested that one offender was responsible. Then, on the 21st of July, 1988, detectives were called to Sheepshead Mountain. They immediately feared that another victim of the so-called choke and dump attacker had been found. This time, the woman was dead. She was lying near the side of the road, nude from the waist down. The area had changed somewhat over the years, because road graders occasionally passed through, but at the time, the body was lying farther down in a ditch. The woman had clearly been dead for some time. Her skin was brown and blistered from prolonged exposure to the desert sunblood, covered her legs and feet, but something about the scene immediately caught investigators' attention. It appeared that she had still been alive after the initial attack. Marks in the dirt suggested that she had struggled to move. Impressions left by her arms showed that she had been flailing against the ground. Detectives then discovered a trail of blood. Alongside it were the woman's bare footprints. The tracks extended almost a mile down the mountain. Investigators followed them back toward the top. There, they discovered a pair of shoes, pieces of clothing, two separate sets of footprints, and clear signs of a struggle. The footprints eventually led to a parking area. There, police found another tire track. It appeared that a vehicle had driven into the area, turned around, and then left. From the clearing, the victim's bare footprints led into the brush. Somehow, after the attack, she had managed to regain consciousness. She made her way out of the area, returned toward the road, and began walking down the mountain in search of help. But she never made it. When investigators examined the body more closely, they discovered something unusual. Hundreds of tiny, living, worm-like creatures were feeding on the remains maggots. Instead of treating them as meaningless evidence of decomposition, investigators carefully collected and preserved them. The specimens were sent to the forensic laboratory. At the time, detectives had no idea that these insects might eventually become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. Could they reveal when the woman died? Could they help reconstruct her final hours? And could they somehow connect her death to the man responsible for the other desert attacks? The autopsy soon produced another major surprise. Investigators initially believed the woman had been strangled to death. There was evidence that she had probably been choked, but strangulation was not the actual cause of death. The medical examiner determined that she had suffered a severe vaginal laceration. She ultimately died from massive blood loss caused by that injury. The victim was identified as Sandra Swick, a 43-year-old transient from Florida. Her body had been found in the same general area where many of the other choke and dump victims had been discovered. The similarities continued. Most of the victims had been abandoned roughly the same distance from the interstate highway. The attacker often selected secluded areas near a fork or V-shaped section of road, where he could pull over without being easily seen by passing motorists. Police were now more convinced than ever that Sandra Swick belonged to the same series of crimes, but they still had one major problem. They had no suspect, no name, no definitive physical evidence, no direct connection between the crime scenes and any individual. Then, 3 months after Swick's murder, investigators finally got the break they had been waiting for. Sheriff's Deputy Larry Daly was patrolling the mountain roads when he noticed a vehicle emerging from a deserted side road.
And as I came around the bend here, I could see the car coming out.
Something about the situation caught Daly's attention. He turned onto the same side road, and almost immediately, he saw a woman lying on the ground. She was unconscious, but still alive.
I saw the victim laying on the ground, pants down past her knees, her shirt pulled up to her neck, as if someone had choked her.
The scene looked disturbingly familiar. Daly immediately called for an ambulance. Then he radioed a description of the vehicle he had just seen leaving the area. After nearly 3 years of frustration, police may finally have been only minutes behind the man they had been hunting. After finding the unconscious woman in the desert, Sheriff's Deputy Larry Daly rushed back to his patrol vehicle and called for help. He also radioed a description of the car he had just seen leaving the deserted side road. A short time later, another officer spotted and stopped a silver Honda matching Daly's description. After 3 years of frustration, investigators finally had someone they could question. One detective later recalled what he had imagined the attacker would look like.
What I wanted to see was I wanted to see a monster. I wanted to see this monstrous man, maybe someone with 3 arms, who came out and was abducting women and strangling them.
But the man behind the wheel looked nothing like that. He was 41-year-old Ronald Porter, an automotive mechanic. More importantly, Porter already had a history of sexual offenses. The woman Deputy Daly had found unconscious survived the attack. Once she recovered, she was able to identify Porter as the man who had attacked her. Confronted with the evidence, Porter admitted responsibility for that assault, but he refused to admit involvement in any of the other attacks that had occurred over the previous 3 years. Investigators, however, believed they had finally found the man responsible for the entire series. They also suspected that Porter had murdered Sandra Swick 3 months earlier. The question now was whether they could prove it. To determine whether all of the attacks were the work of one offender, San Diego authorities contacted the FBI, specifically a unit experienced in studying serial violent offenders. Investigators compared the crimes in detail. The victims were remarkably similar. The offender targeted vulnerable women. He approached women who were hitchhiking or living on the margins of society. He offered them rides. He drove them into isolated mountain areas. He used nearly identical methods to overpower them. And the victims were repeatedly abandoned in almost the same kinds of remote locations. One investigator summarized the problem this way: for another offender to independently select the same type of victim, abduct her in the same way, take her to the same type of isolated location, carry out the same acts, and leave her in nearly identical areas would require an extraordinary coincidence. The FBI concluded that the probability strongly favored one person being responsible for the entire series. One of the most important features connecting the crimes was what FBI investigators considered a signature element: the remote desert dump sites. The attacker had clearly invested considerable time and effort in finding secluded locations where he could assault his victims without being seen. These were not random stopping points. He knew where he was going. Another consistent feature was his choice of victims. The attacker appeared to evaluate.
He's making an assessment before he decides he's going to go ahead and ask her if she needs a ride. And when he's made that initial impression, then once he's decided, yeah, I can control this victim, then she gets in the car, and then it becomes somewhat of a game with him to get her where he wants to go.
With the FBI convinced that the attacks were connected, San Diego investigators now faced the next challenge: proving that Ronald Porter was responsible. They began comparing evidence recovered from Porter's property with evidence collected from the earlier crime scenes. One of the first important matches involved the tiny red carpet fiber found on Betty Base's blouse. Investigators examined the carpeting inside Porter's car under a microscope Fibers from the vehicle were found to be microscopically similar to the red fiber recovered from Betty's clothing. Then detectives turned to the tire track evidence. Tracks found at several crime scenes were compared with a Michelin spare tire found in the trunk of Porter's car. The tread pattern was similar. Police also searched Porter's apartment. There they recovered shoes and boots, whose tread patterns were consistent with footprints found at several of the choke and dump crime scenes. The evidence was beginning to accumulate, but then investigators found something even more significant. Inside Porter's storage shed was a walkie-talkie. Police traced it to another woman who had previously been choked and abandoned in the desert mountains of Florida. That attack had occurred several years earlier. The same victim had been wearing a blouse that contained a semen stain. Investigators compared the biological evidence from that blouse with a blood sample taken from Ronald Porter. DNA testing produced a match. For detectives, the pattern now appeared overwhelming. Porter had been identified by a surviving victim. Fibers from his car resembled fibers found on another victim. His tires and footwear were consistent with impressions recovered from multiple scenes. Property belonging to a previous victim was found in his possession, and DNA linked him directly to another sexual assault. But despite all of this evidence, prosecutors faced a serious legal problem. By the time Porter was arrested, the statute of limitations had expired on most of the assault cases. That meant prosecutors could no longer bring charges for many of the earlier attacks. If they wanted to send Ronald Porter to prison for a significant period of time, they would have to prosecute him for the one crime that had no statute of limitations problem, the murder of Sandra Swick. Unfortunately, the Sandra Swick case was also their weakest case. Investigators had found no semen linking Porter to the scene. No blood, no hair, no clothing fibers. The tire track discovered at the Swick crime scene was too faint to analyze properly. Some tennis shoe impressions recovered that were similar to a pair of shoes found in Porter's apartment, but Porter's defense attorney argued that this was far from conclusive. Millions of people could own shoes with similar tread patterns, and prosecutors faced another major problem. They could not determine exactly when Sandra Swick had died. Traditional forensic pathology could only provide a broad estimate, time of death. Calculations become increasingly uncertain as decomposition progresses, especially in extreme environmental conditions. As one expert explained,
time of death determination by pathologists is a very inexact science, if it's a science at all. There are certain changes the body undergoes, and we can predict general time frames for those, but there's a lot of different variables that affect it.
Without a reliable time of death, investigators could not determine whether Ronald Porter even had the opportunity to kill Sandra Swick. They needed more, and that brought them back to the hundreds of tiny creatures that had been collected from Swick's body, the maggots. Could those insects establish when Sandra Swick died, and could they finally provide the missing link between her murder and Ronald Porter? When detectives discovered Sandra Swick's body on Sheepshead Mountain, it was already badly decomposed. The intense desert heat and sunlight had taken a heavy toll on the remains. Hundreds of tiny worm-like creatures were feeding on the decomposing tissue. Investigators realized that these maggots might provide information that traditional forensic methods could not. They carefully collected approximately 100 specimens and sent them to the laboratory of David Faulkner, a forensic entomologist who specialized in studying insect activity on human remains. Faulkner explained that insects can reveal an extraordinary amount of information. They can sometimes help determine where a body has been, how long it has been exposed, what environmental conditions surrounded it after death, and, most importantly in this case, approximately how long the person had been dead. His first task was to determine exactly what kind of insects had been collected and how far they had developed. Some of the maggots were immediately preserved in alcohol, so their developmental stage would remain exactly as it had been when investigators discovered the body. Others were allowed to continue developing. Eventually, the larvae formed hardened pupal cases. About a week later, adult flies emerged. Hans Faulkner had adult specimens. He could compare them with the many species of flies that inhabited the California desert where Swick had been found. After hours of examination and analysis, he identified them. They belonged to the genus Sarcophaga, commonly known as flesh flies. These flies had one particularly important characteristic. Unlike some other species, they could remain active under relatively poor weather conditions. As Faulkner explained, even during foggy, rainy, or overcast conditions, flesh flies could continue searching for a suitable host, while some other species might remain inactive until the weather became warmer or sunnier. Hans Faulkner knew the species. he could begin reconstructing the insect's developmental timeline. The most advanced specimens collected from Swick's body were already in their third and final larval stage. That gave investigators a biological clock. Faulkner explained the process.
Once you have them identified, you know what stage in development the most developed ones are, then you go backwards and say, okay, this was the temperature regime at that time. This is how long this particular insect takes to develop to this stage. Therefore, that body was available to these insects for this amount of time. Usually, that indicates how long the person's been dead.
Under normal weather conditions, it might take approximately a week for newly deposited larvae to reach their third developmental stage. But conditions in the California desert were far from normal. During the week Sandra Swick's body was discovered, daytime temperatures averaged approximately 92 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, the insects developed much faster. Faulkner calculated that it would take only about 3.5 days for freshly deposited larvae to reach the third and final larval stage found on Swick's body. That dramatically narrowed the timeline. But Faulkner was able to go even further. The developmental stage of the sarcophaga larvae, combined with their behavior, suggested that the flies had first reached Swick's body during daylight. These flesh flies would not normally deposit their larvae in darkness. That meant investigators could establish a much more precise window. Sandra Swick was still alive when the sun went down on Sunday, the 17th of July, but she was dead by daylight on Monday, the 18th of July. At the first available daylight after her death, flesh flies would have been attracted to the chemical odors produced by decomposition. They arrived and deposited their larvae. Those larvae then developed rapidly in the desert heat. Faulkner explained that if Swick had remained alive until Monday afternoon or Monday evening, there simply would not have been enough time for the larvae to reach the developmental stage investigators observed when her body was discovered.
The maggots would not have been as developed if she had been alive longer. If she had been alive Monday afternoon, Monday evening, there's no way that these flies under those temperature conditions could have developed to that stage.
For the first time, investigators had a scientifically supported time frame for Sandra Swick's death. Now they could examine Ronald Porter's whereabouts during that exact period. Porter was working as an automotive mechanic at a chain repair shop. Investigators subpoenaed his timesheets. The records showed that Porter was not at work on Sunday, the 17th of July. More importantly, he could provide no alibi explaining where he had been that day. The timeline fit. One investigator explained that they now had a period during which Porter was available to drive from the northern part of the county, pick up Sandra Swick, and transport her into the eastern mountain region. The insect evidence had done something traditional pathology could not. It had created a narrow enough time frame to show that Ronald Porter had the opportunity to commit the crime, combined with the striking similarities between Swick's murder and the other choke and dump attacks. Prosecutors believed they finally had enough evidence. Ronald Porter was charged with the murder of Sandra Swick. Investigators reconstructed what they believed happened that night. They believed Porter picked up Swick while she was hitchhiking somewhere near an entrance ramp to Interstate.
I'm going to Florida.
Jump in. I can take you about 40 miles to El Centro.
That'd be great.
How you doing?
Good.
As the car traveled east into the mountains, Porter left the main highway and drove onto a dark, isolated road. Investigators believed he may have used the same excuse he had used in previous attacks, that he needed to stop for a bathroom break. After stopping the car, Porter walked around the rear of the vehicle. Then, according to the prosecution's reconstruction, he attacked Swick from behind. He grabbed her around the neck in a military-style chokehold, pulled her from the car, and strangled her until she lost consciousness. He then threw her onto the ground, removed part of her clothing, and sexually assaulted her with his hand. Afterward, Porter returned to his car and drove away. But Sandra Swick was still alive. Sometime later, she regained consciousness. She was dizzy, disoriented, and bleeding heavily from the injuries she had suffered. Barefoot and alone in the darkness, she began walking down the deserted mountain road. Investigators later traced her blood and footprints for almost a mile. She kept walking until she could go no farther. Eventually, she collapsed. The severe lacerations caused during the assault continued bleeding. Sandra Swick died from blood loss. One investigator described her death simply.
Her death had to be a tough one. Very difficult, long, dying process that she went through.
Without the insects found on her body, investigators might never have been able to establish when that process occurred. But forensic entomology provided the missing piece. The insects revealed a time of death that no other available method could determine with sufficient precision. The case eventually went before a jury and, The verdict was returned.
Find the defendant, Ronald Elliott Porter, guilty of the crime of murder.
Ronald Porter was convicted of second-degree murder in the death of Sandra Swick. He was sentenced to 28 years to life in prison. Porter continued to maintain his innocence. But for investigators, the insect evidence had been a crucial part of the case. David Faulkner later explained just how much information insects can provide in forensic investigations. They may help determine how long a body has been exposed, whether it was moved, whether it had been buried, and even whether certain drugs or poisons may have been present. In Sandra Swick's case, the smallest witnesses at the crime scene ultimately provided investigators with something no human witness could: a biological clock counting backward from her death. While forensic insects were helping investigators solve Sandra Swick's murder in California, another mystery was unfolding hundreds of miles away. This time, the threat was not a serial predator. It was an unexplained illness. Residents of South Dakota and Minnesota were suddenly developing a strange collection of symptoms. There had been only one similar outbreak before, and the last time it happened, medical investigators had been unable to determine the cause. The new outbreak centered around Valley Springs, South Dakota, a small farming community of roughly 800 people near the Minnesota border. It was a community made up of farmers and suburban professionals, many of whom worked in nearby Sioux Falls. People there were accustomed to hard work and harsh weather. They were not the type to complain easily, so when residents began reporting irregular heart rhythms, fevers, weight loss, diarrhea, nervousness, and unexplained muscle aches and pains, people began to wonder whether this was more than coincidence. One patient remembered,
"I was just fidgety and nervous, and not all the time. I guess that's what threw you off. If it had been that steady, you couldn't have put up with it."
Heart would be there, you feel your pulse and it's just pounding. You could feel your heart pounding, and you ached. Your legs and arms hurt real bad.
I started getting chills. Then I'd get hot flashes. Then I couldn't eat, and I'd be nauseated. Everything was just happening really, really fast.
Everything seemed to happen at once. At first, local doctors were just as confused as the patients. Zone woman Jane Nedestad was initially thought to be suffering from a nervous breakdown. Her physician admitted her to the hospital.
I'd never, had any of this problem before with a mental problem. So he put me on a mood elevator, and about 8 hours later, my heart was 160 beats per minute. And I just knew I was going to have a heart attack. It felt like it was just flying out of my chest.
About 10 miles away, in Luverne, Minnesota, residents were reporting almost identical symptoms. Zone of them was Tony Dispinet. At around 3 in the morning, Tony woke with severe tightness in his chest.
Well, about 3 o'clock in the morning, approximately 3, I woke up with a tightness in my chest. It felt like somebody was sitting on it.
Convinced that he was having a heart attack, he rushed to the emergency room. Tests showed that it was not a heart attack, but doctors still had no explanation. Tony remained in the hospital for 3 days, while physicians tried to determine what was happening. Some doctors initially suspected influenza, others considered a viral infection. But as the illness continued for weeks, residents began comparing their experiences. They realized that many people around them were suffering from the same unusual combination of symptoms. People started asking the obvious questions. Was it contagious? Was something wrong with the drinking water? Was there an environmental contaminant? And why were so many people in such a small area becoming sick at the same time? One of the patients, Richard Jacobson, went to his doctor and was told that his thyroid appeared to be malfunctioning. He was referred to one of the region's leading thyroid specialists. But before seeing the specialist, Jacobson asked a simple question.
"Doc, can you tell me why there's 5 people in my small town with the same condition?"
That question caught the attention of Dr. Michael McMillan, a thyroid specialist who had practiced in South Dakota for approximately 30 years. At first, McMillan thought Jacobson might be exaggerating. Still, the question bothered him, so he decided to investigate. He went to a local hospital and began reviewing recent patient records. What he found was alarming. There had been a noticeable increase in patients reporting symptoms consistent with thyroid disease. But there was a problem. When McMillan reviewed their x-rays and examinations, the patient's thyroid glands appeared normal. That did not fit the usual pattern. The thyroid is a small butterfly-shaped gland located at the base of the neck. It produces hormones that help regulate metabolism and growth. When too much thyroid hormone enters the bloodstream, the body can effectively be pushed into overdrive, The nervous and cardiovascular systems become overstimulated. Patients can experience rapid or irregular heartbeats, weight loss, diarrhea, nervousness, and severe muscle aches. The symptoms fit, but the thyroid glands themselves did not appear enlarged or obviously diseased. Dr. McMillan began searching medical journals for clues.
And I came across a title that said, First Ever Epidemic of Silent Thyroiditis, York, Nebraska. Well, York, Nebraska is about 120 miles south of here.
York, Nebraska was only about 120 miles south. Even more strikingly, that outbreak had occurred just 1 year earlier. Residents there had suffered from many of the same symptoms: heart problems, fever, fatigue, loss of appetite, and severe weight loss. So many people had become ill that the outbreak had begun affecting the economy of the small farming community. Doctors from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention had been called in to investigate, but even that earlier investigation had failed to clearly identify the cause before the outbreak subsided. Now, the same kind of mystery appeared to be happening again. By June 1985, approximately 50 cases had been identified in 2 neighboring communities, Luverne, Minnesota, and Valley Springs, South Dakota. The CDC was called in. Investigators immediately faced a fundamental problem. They did not know what they were looking for. Was the cause in the air, the water, the food? Was it an infectious disease spreading from person to person? Or was the apparent cluster merely a coincidence? The outbreak affected both men and women. People of different ages became sick. There was no obvious connection to a particular occupation. No single workplace was affected. There were no obvious school clusters. Entire families were becoming ill. One possibility was that the disease was contagious. To investigate, everyone suspected of having the illness underwent blood testing. Epidemiologists also conducted extensive interviews. They asked residents what they ate, where they worked, where they shopped, and what they believed was causing the mysterious illness. One question produced an unexpectedly common answer. The region had experienced numerous tornadoes the previous year. Many residents speculated that the storms might have stirred up chemicals that later contaminated the water supply. It was only a theory. Investigators needed evidence. Blood tests soon confirmed one important fact. Every affected patient had abnormally high levels of thyroid hormone in the bloodstream. In some cases, hormone levels were 8 to 10 times higher than normal, but tests of the local drinking water found nothing that could explain the outbreak. The mystery deepened. To help solve it, investigators brought in Dr. Louis Braverman, one of the country's leading experts on thyroid disease. He traveled to South Dakota and examined several patients. One household was particularly striking. 4 generations of the same family were living under one roof. From a 4-year-old child to an elderly great-grandfather in his 80s or 90s, multiple family members showed signs and symptoms of thyrotoxicosis, a condition caused by excessive thyroid hormone in the body. Yet none of them had enlarged thyroid glands. This was extremely unusual. Historically, enlarged thyroids had once been so common in this part of the United States that the region became known as the goiter belt. A goiter is an enlargement of the thyroid gland. For many years, iodine deficiency had been common in the Midwest because the soil contained little iodine and residents consumed relatively little seafood. As a result, thyroid enlargement was widespread. The problem was so significant that thyroid disease had long been a major medical concern in the region. Over time, improved nutrition and access to iodine greatly reduced those problems. But this new outbreak was completely different. These patients had normal-looking thyroid glands, yet their bloodstreams contained enormous amounts of thyroid hormone, and for some patients, the consequences were severe. One patient developed an irregular heartbeat so serious that she went into heart failure and required intensive care. Doctors considered whether a virus might somehow be damaging the thyroid and releasing stored hormones into the bloodstream. To investigate, health officials collected throat and stool specimens. Every test came back negative. There was still no explanation. Then Dr. McMillan noticed something unusual about the geography of the outbreak. Valley Springs and another nearby community were only a few miles apart. The towns were similar in size, yet Valley Springs had multiple cases, while the neighboring community had none. Even more striking, The apparent center of the outbreak was Luverne, Minnesota, and initially there were virtually no cases west of Valley Springs. Whatever was causing the illness did not appear to be spreading randomly. There was some geographic pattern investigators had not yet understood. Then a woman from Sioux Falls contacted Dr. McMillan. She was suffering from the same thyroid disorder. Her name was Rhonda Pesky. At first, her case appeared to undermine the geographic theory. She lived outside the main outbreak area, but investigators soon discovered an important connection. Rhonda's parents owned a grocery store in Valley Springs, and she occasionally bought groceries there. Dr. McMillan decided to visit the store. The owners, Larry and Margaret Long, were perfectly healthy. Their daughter was sick. Why? As McMillan looked around the store, he noticed one particularly popular product, extra lean ground beef. That observation would eventually redirect the entire investigation. When Dr. McMillan learned that Rhonda Pesky, the daughter of a grocery store owner, had developed thyrotoxicosis while her parents remained healthy, he began looking more closely at what the family ate. The grocery store owned by Larry and Margaret Long sold a particularly popular specialty item, extra lean ground beef. Dr. McMillan asked the Longs how often they ate the hamburger themselves. They laughed. Almost never. The meat was so popular that it usually sold out before they had a chance to take any home. Larry Long remembered it as excellent ground beef. It was approximately 90% lean, which made it especially attractive to customers. But there was one important detail. Their daughter Rhonda occasionally took groceries home from the store, and she may have taken some of that ground beef with her. Dr. McMillan decided to test it. On a hunch, he collected a sample and sent it for analysis. By this point, the outbreak had grown dramatically. More than 100 people had developed the mysterious thyroid condition. For some patients, the symptoms had become frightening.
When I had that thyroid scan, a couple gals that work in the hospital, they thought I had cancer is what they told me. They told me this personally, that we thought you were dying of cancer because I looked so bad when I went in for this thyroid scan.
Then, of course, the world's greatest endocrinologists were called in, and we had, I remember the meeting with them, and we laid out all the data, told everything, and they sat there and shrugged their shoulders and said, "We don't know what this is."
The one thing everyone agreed on was that affected patients had extraordinarily high levels of thyroid hormone in their blood, sometimes 8 to 10 times the normal amount. Those elevated hormone levels explain the racing hearts, fatigue, nervousness, weight loss, and muscle pain, but they still did not explain where the hormones were coming from. Then investigators encountered an entire extended family suffering from the condition. Almost everyone in the household tested positive. There was only one exception. A teenage boy investigators immediately wanted to know what made him different. The father worked at a local meatpacking plant and regularly brought ground beef home for the family. It was the same meatpacking plant that supplied the Long's grocery store with extra lean ground beef. The entire family ate the hamburger. Except the teenage boy, he simply did not like meat. Aside from the occasional pepperoni pizza, he avoided it. That detail was critical. For the first time, investigators had a clear dietary difference between someone who became sick and someone living in the same household who did not. Ground beef now became the primary suspect. Samples of hamburger from the meatpacking plant were sent to a local pathologist. Using a cryostat, the pathologist rapidly froze a portion of the hamburger. Freezing transformed the soft tissue into a firm block that could be sliced into extremely thin sections. Those sections were then stained and examined under a microscope. What the pathologist saw was unusual. Mixed into the ordinary beef tissue were small pieces of something that should not have been there. Animal thyroid tissue. That discovery immediately raised alarm. Animal thyroid glands contain extremely high concentrations of thyroid hormones. Investigators now had a possible explanation for the outbreak. People might not have been suffering from diseased thyroid glands at all. They may have been eating thyroid hormones hidden inside their hamburger. But finding thyroid tissue in the meat did not automatically prove that it was responsible for the illnesses. Researchers needed to determine whether those hormones could survive digestion and enter the bloodstream in large enough amounts to cause thyrotoxicosis. So they designed an experiment.
One can say, well, just because you find it in the hamburger, how do you know that when the people eat the hamburger that they're really absorbing the thyroid hormones? So our next step was to feed the ground beef from Minnesota to rats.
One group of laboratory rats was fed raw hamburger collected from Minnesota. A second group was fed ordinary raw hamburger purchased near the laboratory in Worcester, Massachusetts. The difference was obvious. The rats that ate the Minnesota hamburger became unusually nervous and hyperactive. Dr. Braverman remembered,
These rats were wild rats. I mean, they were very jittery, nervous, and this is compared to the rather tranquil, normal behavior of the rats fed the Worcester hamburger. So that there's no question that these rats were, if one could use the expression, clinically thyrotoxic.
People in Valley Springs and Luverne were not eating raw hamburger. They cooked it. Normally, cooking destroys many harmful bacteria and microorganisms. Residents in the Midwest also tended to cook hamburger thoroughly. Would cooking destroy the thyroid hormones as well? Investigators needed to know. To test the theory directly in humans, 4 young physicians volunteered for a controlled experiment. They arrived in the morning after fasting overnight. Researchers drew blood samples to establish their baseline hormone levels. Then each volunteer was given a thoroughly cooked half-pound hamburger made from the same meat sold in the affected communities. The hamburgers were served with onions and toast. As one researcher recalled, the volunteers enjoyed the unusual breakfast. Their blood was then monitored. The experiment confirmed the suspicion. Even after the hamburger was thoroughly cooked, the thyroid hormones remained biologically active. Cooking did not eliminate the problem. The contaminated meat could raise thyroid hormone levels in humans. Investigators finally understood what was making people sick. Now they needed to determine how thyroid tissue had ended up in ground beef in the first place. The meat came from a local slaughterhouse in Luverne, Minnesota. Public health officials inspected the plant and began examining how the animals were processed. They discovered that the facility had once operated using kosher slaughtering practices. Under the plant's earlier processing methods, animals were thoroughly bled. The thyroid gland normally has an extremely rich blood supply, and therefore appears deep red. After extensive bleeding, however, the gland becomes much paler. That made it easier for workers to distinguish the thyroid from surrounding neck muscle and remove it during processing. At the time, slaughterhouses had another financial reason to remove thyroid glands carefully. They could sell them to pharmaceutical companies. Before synthetic thyroid hormones became widely available, drug manufacturers extracted hormones from animal thyroid glands to produce medications for patients with thyroid disease. So the glands had value. Workers removed them, drug companies purchased them, and they never entered the human food supply. But eventually 2 things changed. First, the Luverne plant stopped using its earlier kosher slaughtering process. The thyroid glands were therefore more difficult to distinguish visually from the surrounding tissue. Second, pharmaceutical companies increasingly switched to synthetic thyroid hormones. They no longer needed to purchase large quantities of animal thyroid glands. Suddenly, the glands had little commercial value, and without the previous incentive to remove them carefully, pieces of thyroid tissue began slipping into meat trimmed from the animals' necks. The problem centered around what meat processors called gullet trim. The gullet area comes from the lower portion of the animal's neck. Lean muscles surrounding that area can be removed and used in ground meat. The problem is that the thyroid gland sits directly beneath some of those muscles. If a worker trimmed too deeply or was not careful, a portion of the thyroid could easily be cut away along with the meat. Once those pieces were mixed with ordinary beef and ground together, there was no visible way for consumers to know that thyroid tissue was present. The contaminated trim entered hamburger production. The meatpacking plant was producing the equivalent of roughly 3,600 hamburger patties every day. People bought the meat, they cooked it, they ate it, and unknowingly, some were consuming enough animal thyroid hormone to send their own bodies into severe thyrotoxicosis. The mystery had finally been solved. As soon as investigators identified the source, the meat was recalled. The processing plant also implemented safeguards to ensure that thyroid tissue would no longer enter meat intended for human consumption. After approximately 7 months of investigation, health officials had finally identified the cause of the outbreak. It was a surprisingly simple explanation for an extraordinarily complicated medical mystery. Investigators also believe that contaminated meat had probably caused the similar outbreak in York, Nebraska the previous year. That earlier epidemic had baffled medical investigators. Now it finally had a plausible explanation. Following the investigation, the U.S. Department of Agriculture introduced stricter rules governing the removal of meat from the neck region. The thyroid gland was designated as tissue that should not enter food intended for human consumption. The outbreak ended. In total, 121 residents developed thyrotoxicosis. Fortunately, everyone recovered. There were no deaths. The investigation later became an important teaching case for epidemiologists. It demonstrated how difficult an outbreak can be to solve when the source is neither infectious nor obvious. Investigators had to combine geography, patient interviews, laboratory testing, animal experiments, food inspection, and simple observation. In the end, the solution came from a combination of scientific skill, intuition, and a little luck. A mysterious illness that had frightened entire communities was traced back to something almost no one would have suspected: tiny pieces of animal thyroid hidden inside ordinary ground beef. The fingerprint should never have mattered. Not on that surface, not in that place. Not after surviving decades of dust, false leads, changing technology, and forgotten promises. But it was still there, waiting, pressed into the edge of a truth that no one had been able to uncover. For years it had been hiding in plain sight, while an entire community learned to live with a question instead of an answer. The night it began, the rain had just stopped. The cold Washington air hung heavily over the pavement, and streetlights reflected off the wet asphalt. Pulse radios crackled with routine chatter until one call suddenly changed everything. A vehicle had been found left running. A door was ajar, and no one inside the nearby house was responding. By the time officers arrived, the vehicle's engine had cooled. The house was silent, too silent. Not the peaceful silence of people sleeping, but the rigid stillness of something interrupted. Inside, there were no obvious signs of violence. No overturned furniture, no shattered glass. No blood, only absence. A woman's keys were still on the counter. Her purse remained near the door. Her shoes were neatly arranged as though she expected to return. The television appeared to have been left in the middle of a program. Dinner had been partly prepared. Vegetables sat drying on a cutting board. It looked as though time had simply stopped. The woman was gone. The word missing entered the police system that night and would remain attached to the case for years. Missing mother, missing neighbor, missing friend. There was no ransom demand. No goodbye note. No clear reason for her to disappear. During the first few hours, police moved quickly. Patrol officers searched the surrounding area. Investigators canvassed the neighborhood. Neighbors were interviewed, but memories were vague and uncertain. Someone remembered a car moving slowly through the area. Another thought they had seen a shadow near the driveway. Someone else recalled hearing a sound that might have been a door closing. Or perhaps it had simply been the wind. By morning, the investigation was already beginning to fragment into possibilities. Search teams expanded their efforts. Helicopters scanned tree lines. Volunteers gathered wearing reflective vests and carrying freshly printed missing person flyers. The woman's face appeared everywhere, smiling from photocopied pages, olive in the photograph, unaware that she had already become part of a category that too often ends badly. Days became weeks. Weeks became speculation. Paulus first treated the disappearance as suspicious, then unexplained, and eventually, cautiously, they began considering something darker. But there was no body, and there was no crime scene that clearly indicated murder. Every step forward felt uncertain. Inside the house, forensic investigators worked methodically. They dusted surfaces, swabbed handles, collected fibers, photographed rooms. Everything that might someday matter was documented, packaged, and preserved. Among those items was something that seemed almost insignificant: a faint, partial fingerprint recovered from the inside of a utility room door. It was smudged, incomplete, too limited to identify. At the time, it could not be matched to anyone. Investigators already had piles of evidence that seemed to lead nowhere. The fingerprint did not appear important enough to change the case, so it was logged, filed, and eventually forgotten. The investigation slowed. Media coverage faded. New leads stopped coming. Detectives moved on to other assignments. The woman's name disappeared from daily headlines and returned only occasionally, usually on anniversaries. Always accompanied by the same words: cold case, still missing, family still searching. Years passed. Her child grew older without answers. Birthdays came and went, so did holidays. There was always an empty place where someone should have been. Eventually, hope became quieter, more private. something family members carried internally rather than discussed aloud, because talking about the disappearance often made the absence feel even larger. The community changed as well. New families moved into the neighborhood, roads were resurfaced, homes changed owners, life gradually layered itself over the unresolved case, but the evidence remained. Inside a police storage room, boxes accumulated dust, evidence bags aged, labels curled around the edges. Technology advanced. The investigation did not. The case existed in a kind of administrative limbo, not active, not officially forgotten, simply waiting. Until decades later, someone looked again. A routine review of old unsolved cases brought the file back to a detective's desk. There was no major announcement, no new task force, no press conference, just a detective going through old records and asking a basic question. What could investigators today see that investigators back then could not? He opened the box, read through the reports, and immediately noticed the same frustrating facts. No forced entry, no obvious struggle, no body yet. Something about the case felt incomplete. He went through the evidence inventory, then stopped. Fingerprint, partial, utility. Room door. The detective looked at the entry again. Why there? Why on the inside of a room that was reportedly used infrequently? Why had that print survived? He requested the original evidence. Days later, the old evidence package arrived. Inside was a fingerprint card. Against the pale background was a faint gray impression. A partial ridge pattern, barely there, but unmistakably human. Someone had touched that door. The question was who? When the original investigation took place, fingerprint databases were far more limited. A partial print that produced no match often had nowhere else to go. But technology had changed. Databases had expanded. Computer algorithms could compare ridge patterns that investigators decades earlier could not meaningfully search. The detective submitted the old print again. Not because he was confident, because he was curious. Days passed, then weeks. Finally, an alert appeared on a computer screen, possible match. It was not immediately conclusive, but it was strong enough to demand another look. The print appeared to correspond with a fingerprint that had entered a national database years after the woman's disappearance. That print came from an unrelated offense in another state. The man's name initially meant nothing to investigators. He wasn't a family member. He wasn't a known associate of the missing woman. There was no obvious motive, and according to the original case file, there was no reason he should have been inside her home. That was exactly what made the match so important. Cold cases rarely reopen with dramatic revelations. More often they reopen with discomfort, with one fact that no longer fits the accepted story. The detective began investigating the man behind the print. At the time of the disappearance, he had lived in the general area, not next door, not close enough to make him an obvious suspect, but close enough to blend into the neighborhood. He had worked temporary jobs, home repairs, landscaping contract work, the kind of employment that could give someone legitimate reasons to approach homes without attracting attention. Old telephone records were largely gone, memories had faded, but other records survived: work orders, invoices, addresses, small pieces of paper that had once seemed meaningless. One detail stood out. Weeks before the woman disappeared, the suspect had been working near her home. That gave him proximity and possibly opportunity. The fingerprint suddenly looked very different. It was no longer simply an unidentified smudge. It was a connection, a key that had been sitting inside an evidence box for decades. The detective began reconstructing the original night. Weather records showed when the rain had stopped. Neighbors had documented approximately when lights were still visible inside the house. The abandoned vehicle established another point in the timeline, and the utility, room door, became increasingly important. It was not the home's primary entrance. It led toward the backyard. The area was poorly lit. The room itself was used mainly for storage and household tasks. According to the case information, the woman normally kept that door secured. The original forensic report also contained a detail that had never received much attention. The partial fingerprint had been recovered near the inside edge of the door frame, close to the latch. It was exactly where someone's hand might naturally press while quietly pulling the door closed. A small detail, but after all these years, it suddenly felt louder than broken glass. Investigators dug further into the suspect's employment history: old tax records, business licenses, subcontracting documents. Much of the paper trail had faded, but it had not completely disappeared. The suspect had worked for a small subcontractor that no longer existed. Many jobs had been paid in cash. Schedules were incomplete, but handwritten logs still contained addresses. And among those records was another important connection to the neighborhood. The detective drove back to the area himself. Decades had changed its appearance. New paint, different vehicles, different residents, but the physical layout remained largely recognizable. The streets, the yards, the sight lines between homes. Standing near the utility room door, the detective realized something. Someone leaving through the rear of the property could reach the side street without being clearly visible from the front of the house. The door offered a discreet exit. Investigators began interviewing former neighbors. Again, reconstructing memories after decades was difficult. People often remember not only what they originally saw, but what they have repeated to themselves over the years. Still, certain details began to emerge. One former neighbor remembered a man doing work nearby shortly before the disappearance. Another vaguely recalled a van parked in an unusual location. Someone else remembered workers leaving tools unattended in the neighborhood. None of these memories proved anything, but together they suggested that a contractor moving around the area would not necessarily have attracted suspicion. The suspect had never appeared in the original investigation, not as a suspect, not as a person of interest, not even as an important witness. He had simply never been looked at. Investigators eventually located him. He was now living in another state. He had another job, a family, an ordinary routine. Nothing about his life immediately stood out. The first interview was intentionally low. A routine follow up a few questions about work he had done decades earlier. The man appeared relaxed, polite. His memory of that period was understandably vague. He said he had worked many jobs and visited many properties. When detectives asked whether he had ever been inside the missing woman's home, he hesitated. Then he said no. After another pause, he qualified the answer. Perhaps he had been there for work. Maybe he had been invited inside. He simply couldn't remember. The detective did not confront him. He allowed the silence to remain. Then another record surfaced. A maintenance request from the woman's home, submitted several weeks before she disappeared. The problem was minor. The utility room light wasn't working properly. The subcontractor listed on the repair record was connected to the suspect's employer. Suddenly, detectives had an innocent explanation for why he might once have been inside the house, but they also had something much more important. They now knew he had direct access to the exact room where the mysterious fingerprint had been found. The case had changed again. The fingerprint alone did not prove what happened. It did not prove murder. It did not even prove when the suspect had touched the door. But after decades of a case defined entirely by absence, investigators finally had something concrete presence. Someone had been there. Someone the original investigators had never seriously examined. And for the first time in decades, the case was no longer sleeping. It was waking up. The fingerprint did not prove guilt. It proved presence. And in a case that had been defined for decades by absence, that was enough to change the direction of the entire investigation. The detective returned to the timeline. The original case file was thick, but uneven. Dense in the beginning, then gradually thinning as leads disappeared, and attention faded. Early investigators had worked hard, but they had also worked under pressure. Pressure from the family, pressure from the media, pressure to classify the disappearance. At first, investigators considered whether she might have left voluntarily. Later, they cautiously began to suspect foul play. But without a body or an obvious crime scene, the case had never moved much further. Now, decades later, investigators reconstructed the night again. Weather records showed that the rain had begun tapering off at approximately 9:42 p.m. Around 9:55 p.m., a neighbor walking a dog noticed that the lights inside the house were still on. At approximately 10:11 p.m., someone reported a vehicle left running. Police arrived shortly after 10:30 p.m. There were still no obvious signs of a struggle, but investigators now understood something the original investigation had never been able to prove. A struggle does not always leave a dramatic scene. Sometimes the most important evidence is what appears almost ordinary. The utility room door became the center of attention. It was not the main entrance to the home. It opened toward the backyard. The area was poorly lit, and the room itself was rarely used except for storage and household chores. According to those who knew the victim, she generally kept the door locked. That meant someone had either unlocked it or already had access. The partial fingerprint had been recovered from the inside edge of the frame near the latch. It was exactly the kind of place someone might place a hand while slowly pulling the door shut quietly, carefully, without allowing it to slam. That detail had existed in the original report for years. No one had emphasized it. Now it seemed impossible to ignore. Investigators continued examining the suspect's history. At the time of the disappearance, he had been in his late 20s. He worked temporary labor jobs, home repairs, landscaping, maintenance, and short-term contracting work. He had no significant criminal history at the time. That explained why the fingerprint had produced no useful match during the original investigation. His print simply had not been in the databases. Investigators were searching. That is one of the realities of cold cases. Sometimes the evidence is already there. It simply isn't ready to speak yet. The detective requested whatever employment records still existed, tax documents, busyness licenses, old invoices, handwritten work logs. The subcontracting company the suspect had worked for was long gone. Many of its jobs had been paid in cash. There were no digital schedules, but fragments of the paper trail remained. Own address appeared on the same block as the victim's home. Then investigators found the maintenance request from the victim's property itself. A few weeks before she disappeared, someone had reported a problem with the utility room light. The company connected to the suspect had been called to handle the repair. The suspect, therefore, had a legitimate reason to have been inside the house. That complicated the fingerprint evidence. His presence could potentially be explained, but it also confirmed something investigators had previously only suspected. He knew the house, he knew the property, and he knew the utility room. The detective returned to the neighborhood. 2 decades had changed the appearance of the area. Homes had been repainted. Vehicles were different. New families had moved in, but the basic layout remained. Standing near the utility room, the detective studied the backyard and the side street. From that door, someone could leave the property without passing through the front of the house. It offered privacy. It offered darkness. And it offered a quick route away. Former neighbors were interviewed again. Reconstructing memories after so many years was difficult. One person remembered a worker in the neighborhood around the time of the disappearance. Another recalled a van parked strangely one afternoon. Someone else remembered tools being left around nearby properties. None of these memories was conclusive, but they demonstrated how easily a contractor could move through the neighborhood without appearing suspicious. The suspect had blended into the background, and because he had never been investigated, he had never needed to explain himself. Police eventually located him in another state. His life appeared ordinary. He was married. He had children. He had steady employment. His neighbors described him in familiar terms: quiet, helpful, keeps to himself. Investigators arranged an interview under the pretense of a routine follow-up. The suspect walked into the room calmly. He answered politely. He smiled at appropriate moments. His memory of events from decades earlier was understandably vague. He had worked many jobs, visited many homes, met countless people. When investigators asked whether he had ever been inside the missing woman's house, however, there was a brief pause. He initially said no. Then he softened the answer. Maybe he had entered the home while working. Maybe someone had invited him inside. He couldn't remember. The detective did not challenge him. He simply let the silence remain. Silence often makes people uncomfortable, and uncomfortable people sometimes begin talking. The suspect filled the space with small talk, traffic, aging, how difficult it was to remember things from so many years ago. The interview ended without confrontation, but investigators were not finished. They ran the fingerprint again, this time using updated parameters and more advanced comparison tools. The apparent match became stronger, still not perfect, but increasingly difficult to dismiss. Then another piece of information emerged. Records showed that shortly after the woman's disappearance, the suspect had abruptly left the area. There was no formal notice, no clear family emergency, no obvious job waiting for him elsewhere. He simply left. His utilities were disconnected early. Rent was reportedly left unpaid. At the time, no one considered it significant. Temporary workers moved frequently. People disappeared from one job and appeared at another. But decades later, the timing looked different. The suspect had left within days of the disappearance. Movement alone did not prove guilt, but timing mattered. Investigators searched for records connected to the vehicle he owned at the time. Most had disappeared, but one maintenance record survived. Days after the woman vanished, the vehicle had been taken to an automotive shop. Among the services listed, interior cleaning and carpet shampooing. No specific reason was given. Years later, investigators tracked down the technician who had performed the work. He could not remember every detail, but something about the job had remained in his memory. The vehicle had been unusually dirty. There was mud dampness and an odor that remained even after the interior was cleaned. At the time, he had thought little of it. Cars arrived dirty every day, but he also remembered the owner being unusually impatient, hovering nearby, repeatedly asking how long the cleaning would take. Again, none of this alone proved anything, but the pattern was growing. Investigators questioned the suspect again. This time, their questions were more focused. his employment history, the timing of his departure, the vehicle, the cleaning. He explained everything calmly. He had moved for better work. He worked dirty jobs, so mud inside the vehicle was normal. Cars developed odors. Interior cleaning was routine. The detective listened without accusation. Cold cases demand patience. A suspect confronted too early can simply stop talking. Then investigators revisited another piece of old evidence, the victim's home computer. The machine was primitive by modern standards, but investigators in the original case had preserved an image of its hard drive. At the time, deleted material had largely been treated as inaccessible. Modern digital, forensic tools changed that. A specialist examined the old data fragments began to emerge, emails, calendar entries, service appointments. And then investigators recovered something much more important, an unsent draft email. The victim had started writing it but never finished. The language was hesitant. She described feeling uncomfortable around someone who had returned unexpectedly, someone who had stood too close to her. Even as she wrote about the encounter, she seemed to question herself. Perhaps she was overreacting. Perhaps it was nothing. The email ended unfinished. The document did not identify a murderer. It did not prove an attack, but it showed that before her disappearance, the victim had experienced an encounter that made her uneasy, and the description was disturbingly consistent with the kind of access the suspect's work might have given him. Investigators returned once more to the utility room door. Advanced examination revealed more than the original partial fingerprint. There were additional smears and traces suggesting repeated contact with the area around the latch. It appeared the door may have been opened and closed several times. Someone may have spent more time there than originally assumed. Investigators also continued examining the suspect's later history. Years after the disappearance, a former co-worker had accused him of inappropriate behavior. The allegation had never resulted in criminal charges, but certain details caught detectives' attention, standing too close, returning unexpectedly, testing boundaries. The similarity to the victim's unfinished email was difficult to ignore. The suspect was interviewed again. This time investigators mentioned the fingerprint. They did not immediately show it to him. They simply said that a print had been recovered. His demeanor changed slightly. He began asking questions. What kind of fingerprint? Where exactly had it been found? Could fingerprints be transferred from one surface to another? The detective answered very little. The interview ended. Soon afterward, the suspect retained an attorney. For investigators, the case was beginning to reach a critical point. But before seeking charges, the detective tried to challenge his own theory. Could the fingerprint have been contamination? The chain of custody appeared intact. Could the suspect's presence inside the house have been innocent? Certainly, he had performed work there. Could his sudden move have been coincidence? Possibly. Could the vehicle cleaning have been routine? Yes, every piece had an alternative explanation. The question was whether all of them did when viewed together. Investigators returned again to the timeline. A friend of the victim had spoken with her by telephone earlier that evening. The conversation had ended abruptly. There was no normal goodbye. The call simply stopped. At the time, the friend had mentioned it to police. It had been treated as insignificant. No investigators looked at it differently. The call ended at approximately 9:48 p.m. Only minutes later, the rain began to taper off. Then came the neighbor walking the dog. Then the report of the running vehicle. The critical window was becoming narrower. The suspect claimed he had been at home that evening watching television alone. There were no witnesses, no receipts, nothing investigators could use to verify the story. Then investigators located old cellular records. They were crude compared with modern location data. The information was incomplete, but during the critical time period, the suspect's phone had connected with a tower located closer to the victim's neighborhood than to his listed residence. It did not place him inside the house, but it was inconsistent with the certainty of his story. The suspect was brought in for another interview. This time, the conversation was no longer casual. Investigators slowly laid out the timeline. When they mentioned the victim's interrupted phone call, he hesitated. He had not known about it. When detectives began asking specifically about the utility room, he became defensive. Why were they so interested in that room? Why did that door matter? Finally, investigators showed him the fingerprint evidence. He denied responsibility immediately. Then he began suggesting explanations: contamination, mistake, transfer. The detective did not argue. He simply allowed the denial to stand beside the evidence. Within days, the suspect's attorney contacted prosecutors. The defense requested access to the evidence. They asked for additional time. They urged caution. But prosecutors had already begun preparing an arrest warrant. It was not rushed. There was no dramatic raid, no press conference, no spectacle. The warrant was approved, and on a gray morning, the suspect was arrested outside his workplace. He did not resist. He appeared confused, almost offended, as though the police had made some enormous mistake. For decades, the case had been recorded as a disappearance. Now, for the first time, authorities publicly used a different word: murder. The cold case was no longer simply open. It was headed to court. After the arrest, the case moved into a new phase. For decades, investigators had been trying to determine what happened. Now prosecutors had to prove it in court. And almost immediately, another unexpected piece of information surfaced. A tip came in from someone who had briefly worked with the suspect years earlier. The person remembered a comment the suspect had once made. At the time, it had seemed vague enough to ignore. Years passed. The memory faded. But after news of the arrest became public, the remark suddenly felt impossible to dismiss. The former coworker remembered the suspect talking about a woman, about something getting out of control, and about needing to leave town quickly. The tipster did not want publicity. He did not want to become part of the case. He simply wanted investigators to know what he remembered. The detective documented the information carefully. It was not enough to prove anything by itself. After so many years, memories could be distorted, details could shift, but investigators now had another piece that appeared consistent with the pattern already developing. The defense would later challenge it, and they would have good reason to, because truth in a decade's old case rarely arrives in one perfect piece. More often, it comes fragmented, layered, incomplete. The trial date was eventually set. By then, decades had passed since the woman disappeared, and since the partial fingerprint had first been recovered from the utility room door. The central challenge was obvious: how much could still be trusted after so much time? That question hung over the courtroom from the beginning. This was not simply a trial of the defendant. In many ways, it was a trial of memory itself: neighbors, friends, former co-workers, investigators. Everyone was being asked to reconstruct events from a period that had long since receded into the past. The prosecution opened without spectacle. There was no dramatic promise that one piece of evidence would solve everything. Instead, prosecutors presented a timeline. A woman disappeared. Her home showed no obvious signs of forced entry. A utility room door appeared to have been used. A partial fingerprint was recovered. Then the case went cold. For decades, nothing happened. Until technology finally gave that print a name. The defense focused on the weaknesses created by time. Memories fade, evidence ages. Forensic technology changes. Witnesses reinterpret events after hearing years of speculation. The defense argued that investigators were not uncovering a new truth. They were reconstructing an old story around evidence that could have innocent explanations. The first witnesses were neighbors and friends. Their testimony was sometimes hesitant. Times had shifted in their memories. Small details had blurred. Some recollections were less certain than they had appeared in the original reports. The defense emphasized every inconsistency, but prosecutors did not attempt to portray human memory as perfect. They acknowledged the problem. Their case, they argued, did not depend on any single person's recollection. It depended on what had physically remained. A forensic fingerprint expert took the stand. She explained exactly what the partial print could establish, and what it could not. She did not claim absolute certainty where the evidence could not support it. She explained the probability of the match and the importance of the print's location. The defense challenged the evidence aggressively. The fingerprint was old. It had been recovered using techniques from an earlier era. It had spent decades in storage. Could contamination have occurred? Could environmental conditions have affected it? Could the print have been left during an innocent maintenance visit? The expert acknowledged the limitations, but she also explained something important. Aging evidence might degrade. It might become harder to interpret. But age itself could not create a ridge pattern that had never been there. A partial fingerprint does not migrate from one person to another. It does not invent an alignment. Whatever its limitations, the print represented contact with that surface. The question was when and why next came the digital forensic specialist. Investigators had recovered the victim's unfinished draft email from the old computer data. The The specialist explained how deleted or unsaved digital information can sometimes survive long after a user believes it is gone. Fragments remain, and improved software can sometimes recover information that earlier investigators could not access. Then the unfinished email was presented. The words were hesitant. The victim appeared to be questioning her own instincts. She described feeling uncomfortable around someone returning unexpectedly, someone standing too close. Even as she wrote about her unease, she seemed to minimize it. Perhaps she was overreacting. Perhaps it was nothing. The email stopped before she finished writing it. The defense objected to the emotional weight of the document. The email did not prove that violence occurred, and it did not directly identify the defendant as the person who frightened her. The prosecution did not claim otherwise. The email was evidence of something narrower. Before she disappeared, she had felt unsafe around someone who had access to her surroundings. The suspect's former co-worker testified next. He was cautious, reluctant. He admitted openly that his memory was not perfect. He described the remark he had heard years earlier, the reference to a woman, something going wrong, and the need to leave town. The defense attacked the delay. Why had he waited so many years? Why had he not reported it at the time? Why had the memory only become important after the arrest? The witness did not pretend to have a perfect answer. At the time, the comment had not seemed significant enough. Only later, after learning about the case, did he begin to wonder whether it meant something more. The prosecution did not present him as the foundation of the case. His testimony was only one more piece throughout the trial. The defendant took notes. He rarely looked directly at witnesses. He rarely looked toward the jury. The defense, meanwhile, built a very different picture of him. They called employers, neighbors, people who had known him over the years. They described him as reliable, quiet, helpful, a man who repaired things, a man who arrived at work on time, a man who did not cause trouble. The implication was clear. This was not the kind of person people imagined when they pictured a murderer. But that was also part of the prosecution's case. The suspect had never stood out. He had spent decades blending into ordinary life. The defense offered an innocent explanation for nearly every suspicious detail. The fingerprint? He had performed legitimate work inside the house. The unfinished email? It reflected the victim's anxiety, not necessarily a genuine threat. The sudden move economic opportunity, the vehicle cleaning routine, maintenance after dirty construction work, the old cellular data, technologically imprecise. The coworker's story, decades, old memory shaped by hindsight. Individually, each explanation was possible. The defense did not deny that the disappearance was tragic. They denied that the evidence proved their client was responsible. The prosecution's final major witness was the detective who had reopened the cold case. He did not take the stand to claim that he had solved the mystery through instinct. Instead, he explained the process. He talked about the evidence box, the aging reports, the fingerprint card that had been properly recovered, documented, and preserved, but had produced no useful result at the time. The case had not stalled because the fingerprint disappeared. It stalled because there was nothing in the available databases to connect it to. Years later, that changed. The detective explained that he had not reopened the case with certainty. He had reopened it with a question. Then he tried repeatedly to disprove his own theory. Could the suspect's presence have been innocent? Could the timing be coincidence? Could the fingerprint have an ordinary explanation? Could the move simply have been a move? Could the vehicle cleaning have been routine? He examined each possibility, but instead of eliminating the suspect, the investigation kept returning to him access, proximity, opportunity, the utility, room maintenance, visit, the fingerprint, the departure shortly after the disappearance, the vehicle cleaning, the cellular data, the unfinished email, and later the co-worker's recollection. No single piece carried the entire case. The prosecution's argument was about convergence. The detective then made a point that quieted the courtroom. The fingerprint had initially meant very little because it belonged to someone investigators had never examined. Had it matched a family member, there might have been an obvious explanation. Had it matched a known suspect, investigators would have followed it immediately. Instead, it belonged to someone who had existed outside the original investigation, someone whose legitimate work had allowed him to move through the area without attracting attention, someone who had benefited from being invisible. The defense objected, arguing that the statement was argumentative, but the larger issue remained. The defendant had never been investigated at the time. The fingerprint changed that. The detective stepped down. The prosecution rested. The defendant chose not to testify. That was his legal right. The defense rested as well. By the time closing arguments ended, the jury was left with a case very different from a modern homicide investigation. There was no single dramatic piece of evidence, no eyewitness to the crime, no perfect forensic link. Instead, there were multiple independent pieces pointing in the same direction. The jurors began deliberating. Inside the jury room, the evidence was examined again. Some jurors focused on the fingerprint. Others were troubled by the suspect's behavior after the disappearance, his sudden departure, the vehicle cleaning, the lack of a verifiable alibi, the unfinished email, the old cellular records. They did not necessarily agree on motive. They did not necessarily agree on exactly how the crime had occurred, but they repeatedly returned to the same question. Why did so many separate pieces lead back to the same person? The defense had offered alternative explanations. Each explanation considered alone was plausible, but the prosecution argued that coincidence becomes harder to accept when one coincidence must be stacked on top of another. Hers passed, then a day, then another. The judge reminded the jurors not to rush. This was a case that had already waited decades. It could wait long enough for careful deliberation. At one point, the jurors returned to the nature of the case itself. A contemporary investigation might have produced more evidence, but this was not a contemporary investigation. The question was not whether the surviving evidence was perfect. The question was whether it was sufficient. They reviewed the unfinished email. They reviewed the timing of the vehicle cleaning. They reviewed the sudden move. They reviewed the fingerprint, still preserved, still connected to the defendant, and still sitting at the center of a case that had once contained nothing but absence. Eventually, the jury reached a decision. The courtroom filled again. The family sat together. They did not celebrate. They held one another's hands and waited. The defendant remained rigid, facing forward. Then the verdict was read. Guilty. The word did not produce celebration. It landed heavily. A breath released somewhere in the courtroom. Someone quietly cried. A chair moved against the floor. The defendant closed his eyes. The judge thanked the jury and scheduled sentencing. For the family, the verdict was not closure. Nothing could restore the years that had been lost. But for the first time, the question they had carried for decades had received an answer. After the courtroom emptied, the detective remained behind for a moment. He thought again about the fingerprint, how small it had been, how easily it could have remained overlooked, how much weight one partial impression had eventually carried. The case had not restored what the family had lost, but it had demonstrated something else. Evidence can survive longer than attention. The fingerprint had waited inside an evidence box until technology, and someone willing to look again, finally gave it meaning. The trial was over, but one enormous question remained unanswered. The jury had decided who was responsible. Investigators still did not know where the missing woman was, and that question would lead the case into its final chapter. The guilty verdict answered one question. It established responsibility, but it did not answer everything. The most painful question remained, where was the victim? For decades, her family had lived without a body, without a grave, and without knowing where her final resting place might be. A conviction could establish who was responsible. It could not, by itself, bring her home. So after the trial, investigators continued working. The defendant was no longer protected by the uncertainty that had surrounded the case for so many years, but he still refused to explain where the victim's remains had been left. Investigators returned to him. This time, they approached him less as interrogators and more as listeners. They offered no dramatic confrontation. They simply made it clear that the legal case was over. The question now was whether he would allow the family to finally know the truth. At first, he said nothing. His attorney advised caution. Appeals were discussed, legal motions continued, but none of that answered the family's only remaining question. They wanted a location, not another courtroom victory, not more publicity. They wanted to end a search that had never truly stopped. Search teams were assembled again. This time, The search was carried out by professionals. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Ground penetrating radar was used. Investigators studied old maps and compared them with decades of development. That was not easy. Landscapes change. Trees are cut down. Roads disappear. Buildings are constructed. Places that were once empty can become neighborhoods, parking lots, or schools. Time does not simply bury evidence. Sometimes it builds directly over it. Investigators reconstructed the defendant's movements from the period surrounding the disappearance. They reviewed his temporary jobs, his former residences, his unexplained trips, and the remote areas he would have known. One location repeatedly attracted attention: a stretch of land near an abandoned service road along a route he could have used when leaving the area. It was not scenic. It was not memorable. It was exactly the kind of place most people would drive past without ever noticing search teams entered the area. At first, they found nothing. Then they discovered something small, a fragment. It was too degraded to identify immediately, but it was enough to justify further testing. The family was informed carefully. Investigators had learned how dangerous premature hope could be. Testing eventually established that the fragment was human. It was old. It appeared to be female, and it was consistent with what investigators were searching for, but the initial discovery was not yet enough to provide complete confirmation. The defendant was confronted with the new development. He listened, asked for water, asked for time. Then, for the first time, something changed. He asked,
"How long will this take?"
It was the first real crack in the silence. The conversation that followed was not a formal confession delivered in one perfect narrative. It unfolded gradually. The detective spoke to him about the burden of carrying a secret for decades, about how silence did not preserve control. It only prolonged suffering. The defendant stared at the table. He rubbed his hands together, the same hands whose ridge patterns had ultimately brought investigators back to him. Then he said something he had never said before.
"He didn't mean for it to happen."
The detective did not interrupt. He allowed him to continue. The account came out unevenly. An argument, fear, a confrontation, a push intended to create distance, a fall that changed everything, then panic. According to the defendant's account, what followed was driven by fear and an attempt to conceal what had happened. He gave investigators a vague description of where he had left the victim trees, water nearby, a place he believed no one would ever search. Search teams returned to the area. They adjusted their coordinates, expanded the search grid, and this time they found more, enough to finally recover the remains for the family. The discovery did not erase decades of grief, but it changed the nature of that grief. For years, they had been forced to imagine countless possibilities. Now they no longer had to wonder. Investigators notified them in person. No phone call, no press statement, no intermediary. The family cried, but this was different from the shock they had experienced years earlier. It was release. The search was finally over. The sentencing hearing came next. The courtroom filled again. But the atmosphere had changed. This hearing was no longer about determining guilt. It was about consequence. The judge spoke about the extraordinary length of time the family had been forced to live without answers, about the damage created not only by the crime itself, but by decades of uncertainty. The defendant was given an opportunity to speak. He apologized. The words were careful, measured, and for the family, inevitably inadequate. But for the first time, the silence had been broken from the inside. The sentence was long and severe. As the defendant was led away, he did not turn toward the family. He simply looked ahead. Outside the courthouse, the response was quieter than it had been after the arrest or verdict. There was no sense of celebration, only acknowledgement. The remains could finally be returned to the family. A memorial could finally be planned. A grave could finally carry a name. The victim would no longer officially exist only as a missing person. But the consequences of the case extended beyond one family. The fingerprint that had sat overlooked for decades became a symbol inside law enforcement, not simply a symbol of success, a symbol of delay, a reminder that important evidence may already exist inside an unsolved case long before technology or investigators are capable of understanding its value. Police agencies began reviewing old evidence more carefully. Cold case files were reopened, evidence rooms were audited, old fingerprint cards were submitted to newer databases. investigators began asking a simple question. What could modern technology see that earlier investigators could not? The detective who reopened the case was asked repeatedly to speak publicly about what had happened: panels, conferences, interviews. He declined many of them. He understood that calling the case a triumph would ignore the most uncomfortable part of the story. The evidence had been there for years. The system simply had not known what to do with it. During one interview, he summarized the lesson in a simple way. The phrase captured something important. Evidence does not lose significance simply because investigators stop looking at it. Technology changes, databases expand, scientific methods improve, and something once considered useless can suddenly become crucial. The family slowly began adjusting to a reality they had spent years believing might never come. Certainty was different from peace. The two were not the same. For decades, their lives had been organized around absence, birthdays, anniversaries, holidays. Every important moment carried the same unanswered question. Now the question was gone, but the loss remained. They began sorting through belongings that had been kept for years: letters, old calendars, clothing, personal items preserved, not because anyone expected them to be used again, but because throwing them away had once felt like surrendering hope. They could finally speak about their loved one in the past tense without feeling that they were giving up on finding her. Victim impact statements later described the true cost of those missing years. A family member spoke about birthdays measured only by how old she would have been. Another remembered repeatedly seeing strangers from a distance, and for one brief moment, believing they recognized her silhouette. A younger relative who had never met her spoke about inheriting a story instead of knowing the person herself. The defendant listened. The damage of the crime was no longer abstract. It had spread across generations. The case also encouraged investigators elsewhere to re-examine their own cold cases. In one neighboring jurisdiction, authorities reviewed another old file and submitted a partial fingerprint through updated databases. A match was returned. Another investigation moved forward. Another family received information they had waited years to hear. The original fingerprint had therefore become more than a piece of evidence in one case. It became a warning. Never assume evidence is obsolete simply because it has not yet produced an answer. Lawmakers and law enforcement agencies discussed funding for forensic backlogs. Training programs emphasized the importance of periodically reviewing dormant evidence. Newer investigators were taught that advances in fingerprint analysis, DNA testing, digital forensics, and databases could transform old evidence into new leads. The lesson was not that every cold case would eventually be solved. Many would not. The lesson was that an unsolved case and an impossible case are not necessarily the same thing. The detective developed a personal habit. He began opening old files regularly, not because he expected to solve one every week, not because he believed every forgotten piece of evidence contained a hidden answer. He simply looked again. A fingerprint, a fiber, an old photograph, a laboratory report, a piece of evidence that someone once cataloged at 3 a.m. before moving on to the next case. He began noticing not criminal patterns, but human ones. Overworked investigators, technology that had reached its limits, clues dismissed not through incompetence or malice, but because there was nowhere else to take them at the time. The case became a reminder that law enforcement is a human system, and human systems are fallible. That made periodic review essential. Eventually, public interest faded. It always does. Headlines moved on. Television coverage disappeared. Online discussions slowed. The fingerprint stopped being news. But inside investigative agencies, its importance remained. The case entered training materials and professional discussions. Young investigators were taught a principle that sounded simple but carried enormous consequences. Never assume something is insignificant just because it hasn't spoken yet. Evidence may remain unchanged for decades. What changes is the context around it. The technology, the databases, the people examining it. The family eventually marked the victim's grave. The headstone was simple, her name, her dates, and a reminder that she had been loved. There was no need to define her by the crime, no need to reduce her life to the circumstances of her disappearance. For years she had been known publicly as a missing woman, then as the victim in a cold case. then as the center of a murder trial. But to her family, she had always been more than that. With the investigation finished, they could slowly begin reclaiming that part of her story. The defendant disappeared into prison life, no longer an unknown figure living an ordinary existence, no longer protected by decades of unanswered questions. His world narrowed to routine. The life he had built after leaving Washington was gone, and the tiny fingerprint he had once left behind had become the piece of evidence that eventually followed him across decades. The detective also eventually moved on. New cases waited, new victims, new families searching for answers, but he kept the notebook from this investigation, not on his desk, in a drawer. He rarely opened it, but he knew exactly where it was. Sometimes he thought about how easily the fingerprint might have remained inside an evidence box forever, how close the case had come to staying unresolved, and how many other pieces of evidence might still be waiting in storage rooms around the country, not because those cases were impossible to solve, but because no one had yet looked at them in the right way. That was the real lesson of the investigation. It was never simply a story about one suspect, or one fingerprint, or one technological breakthrough. It was a story about attention. Time did not solve the case. Time merely allowed the tools to change. The case was solved because someone eventually returned to the evidence and asked the questions again. A woman disappeared. A family spent decades waiting. A fingerprint remained. And eventually, the truth surfaced. Not because fate guaranteed that it would, because someone looked again. The case was finally over, but its lesson remained. Evidence can wait for decades. Justice should not depend on whether someone remembers to look.